Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm Beth Bailey, and today I'm excited to welcome Joan Barker, whose prior work in Afghanistan led her to join the impromptu groups of heroes who dedicated themselves to rescuing Afghans from being left behind after the Taliban took control of Afghanistan in August of 2021. Joan Barker is a former Peace Corps volunteer who gained an extensive background in English instruction before taking on an English teaching role in Kabul between 2017 and 2018. Joan was part of a multifaceted effort to teach aviation English to Afghan Air Force personnel, while contractors and U.S. military personnel simultaneously trained their Afghan counterparts in the operation and maintenance of airframes that were in the Afghan arsenal. When the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan began, some of Joan's company's interpreters and support staff were in the process of applying for special immigrant visas, and she became heavily involved in the digital Dunkirk effort to find them flights from the country. Also in 2022, Joan helped support Afghans who arrived through Operation Allies Welcome at Fort McCoy in Wisconsin. Joan, it's really great to have you on. Thanks for coming to tell us your story.
Thank you for having me on. I really enjoy the podcast.
I've wanted to have you on for many, many moons, so it's great for you to be here. I'd love to dive in with just your first, how did you get started in Afghanistan? What drew you to apply for that job in 2017?
Yeah, so at the time in 2017, I was living and working in Washington, D.C. as a contractor. I was doing some language and culture training with the U.S. military, but those contracts were kind of drying up, turning full-time into part-time, 1099ing, and I had a few years prior to that worked in the UAE, in the United Arab Emirates, on a military base in Abu Dhabi, training Emirati soldiers in English, using the Defense Language Institute, which is the United States' English curricula for partner forces. So I was familiar with the curriculum and working with soldiers. So then 5 years later in 2017, when I found myself looking for jobs, I went back on the job boards looking overseas, and I had friends who had taught within the UAE that were like, hey, there's openings on this military base in Kabul. And so some of them had gone from Abu Dhabi to the NATO base, HKIA in Kabul, and they were like, you should check out the job opportunities here. So I did that. I applied, and then one of the small contracting firms that had just won an award to do maintenance training for the Mi-17 helicopters and PC-12 planes needed some English teacher support to augment their contract. So I applied, and they were like, when can you get on a plane? Like, tomorrow? So I went pretty quickly in August of 2017 over to Kabul.
Wow, what was that like? I mean, what was the preparation process stateside? Like, did you have to go through any of the training things that some contractors go through?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so it was basically I went to the HQ of the company I was working for in Huntsville, Alabama, and did 2 weeks of just all the computer online training. I don't know if you've ever been a civilian contractor with the military, but everything for OPSEC and SEER training, you have to do all these online tutorials that take hours and hours, and you got to take a little test,
online
get your certificate,
training,
and save your PDF. Yeah. And knowing that we're not leaving the civilian contractors, we were not going to leave that little bubble of HKIA and the Afghan military base. So it was, some of the stuff was a little superfluous, but the military has to, they're basically taking charge of you as a civilian contractor, so you have to go through their training and know all of these things to keep yourself safe and keep the mission safe. So that was 2 weeks in Huntsville, and then I went to Fort Bliss, Texas, where all civilian defense contractors go through a week of intense training and medical clearance and background check, whatever, and then they put you on a plane from there, from Fort Bliss to Kuwait to Bagram to whatever base you're going to in Afghanistan. So yeah, but I was excited. I really had enjoyed working on the military base in the UAE, and that was just a fluke. I had found that after I got my TESOL degree, it was my first job overseas, and I loved being part of a mission where I was working with a partner force military, and it's different than working in an academic setting. You're doing something that's meaningful and can help people in real time, capacity building. So I was really excited to be able to do that in an intense environment, like Kabul. I was really looking forward to seeing what that was like and being able to help support the mission there.
That's so cool. What was it like in Kabul? I mean, you stayed inside the wire, except I think you've said to me when we've talked before that you did have to travel to get to...
Yeah.
So what was that like?
Yeah, so to help people visualize it, I always use the metaphor of a pill, a Tylenol, a little pill that's oval shaped, and it's there's like a cut down the middle where it's like red on one side, white on the other side. Like if you can picture that, that's what HKIA was like. On one side of the pill was the NATO base, where all the NATO countries, including the United States, were like the barracks were and the PX and all that stuff, and the runway to come in and out for NATO folks going in and out. And the civilian airport for Kabul was part of that runway. So in that pill that's split down the middle, if you picture like a line going through it, this long runway, on one side it was like civilian, and then on the other side of the pill, on the other side of the runway, was the flight line for the Afghan Air Force. So what we would do every day is we would go from our barracks on the NATO side, drive in a little convoy through a security checkpoint, and then go onto the Afghan side, which was manned and guarded by Afghans. So some people call that outside the wire, but it's still it's guarded and it's secured. NATO is still helping support the Afghan security forces on that side. But you go through the checkpoints, and on one side of their runway is the Afghan Air Force, the conventional forces, and then on the other side of the runway, directly opposite from it, was the Special Mission Wing, also known as the SMW. So sometimes that acronym is thrown around, and the SMW is like their Special Operations Aviation element. So I worked on both sides, a few months on the Afghan Air Force side, a few months on the Special Mission Wing side. Things ran a little differently, but on a daily basis, myself and the other English teachers I worked with, sometimes we'd be working in the back shops, which are like the maintenance back shops, where you actually go into like an aviation hangar. You know, you walk in past like these huge, the Mi-17 helicopters, or the Afghan Air Force had A-29 Super Tucanos. You'd be like walking by them, working on their aircraft, and go to the back of their hangar, and there'd be like the sheet metal shop or the avionics, electronics folks that were doing repairs for that part of the aircraft, all sorts of things. So like you'd go in and you'd meet with the leader of the shop and say like, hey, is there a day of the week where we could come in and work with you guys for like an hour on your English and see what you guys are doing? And it was very like fluid and on the go. And that was on the Afghan Air Force side. On the Special Mission Wing side, it was much more of an organized training pipeline, because the U.S. was responsible for training the pilots and Afghan crew chiefs that were going to go out and do missions. So that was like, we'd be sitting in classrooms training, and they were officially had to like go through a certain point and get like a certificate before they could go to the flight line and do their like on the aircraft training. So yeah, but it was like 6 days a week. Like you get up at 6, go over to the other side, teach from like 7 to 3 or whatever, and they're like 9-10 hour days, 6 days a week.
That sounds really intense. What was it like? I mean, you'd already worked in the UAE alongside foreign military personnel. What was it like working alongside Afghans?
Yeah, so why I mentioned like the time that we put into it and as many hours as we worked is that we formed very close relationships with the Afghans, with whom we trained, and the interpreters that were also supporting that element. You're working with these guys day in and day out. I mean, what was it like? I guess that's like a big question, but I mean, for me, I loved it. I loved getting to know the guys. I started off my career working overseas as a Peace Corps volunteer, like in 2005. So what's that, 18 years ago now? And that was in Niger in West Africa. I lived in a tiny little village off the grid in the middle of nowhere, but it was a Muslim village. And so that was really cool, because I got to learn about Islam and see people practicing it in real time and like learn everything about it. So then when I went to work in the Middle East, like I had this background knowledge of the religion, and used that in the UAE. And then so when I got to Afghanistan, it's very different than the Middle East or West Africa, but I really just enjoy working with folks from other cultures and learning about their lives, their religion. And my students in Afghanistan were very gracious and hospitable. Like when I showed up, like they knew nothing about me, but they welcomed me in, always were taking out their cell phones at the beginning of class, like while we were getting warmed up, and they'd be like showing me pictures from their provinces, pictures of their families. Like they just wanted to share so much. And they knew that we couldn't leave HKIA. And so they were always wanting to show me, like, this is when I go home for my holiday, for Eid or whatever, like look, this is Badashan, or like this is where I go back to outside Kandahar, and they felt so bad that like we were never going to get to see those parts of their life or see their beautiful country. It's such a beautiful country, and I never got to see it. But they were just the most welcoming folks, and I love the guys that we got to work with. And I mentioned the interpreters, and probably talk about that a bit in a little while, but so the students that we were teaching were the soldiers, the pilots, the Afghan crew chiefs, the mechanics, but supporting those elements were a whole cadre of interpreter translators, local folks in Kabul, mostly men, but there were some women, but it was mostly guys that had gone to university in Kabul, studied English. Maybe they were English teachers in Kabul. So that's why their English was so good, and that's why they were brought in to be, they would translate course documents for us. They would help interpret high-level organizational meetings that we were doing with the Afghan commanders to lay out those pipelines and organize class rosters and things like that. So we could not have done what we did without the enabling component of those interpreter translators. So yeah, I just to come back to your question, what was it like? I mean, it was very intense work with the guys all day long, and they became like our friends and our brothers there. And that connection is what later led us to want to fight so hard for them.
And I can imagine that. It's one of the reasons I always ask that question is that people like yourself who have devoted so much to assisting Afghans in the aftermath of this withdrawal or during the withdrawal, they don't do that because Afghans are not lovely people. They do it because Afghans are lovely people, and they're just so, and I think it's so important for anybody who stumbles across this podcast to remember that, because we have so many new arrivals, and I always hear, there are some lovely stories, but I think that a lot of Afghans are struggling to adjust, and that Americans are not being open and inviting because we don't understand how lovely Afghans are and how much they can bring to the community if we welcome them.
I mean, I can talk about that in a little while when I talk about McCoy, but I've also done work in refugee and immigrant education. Like, that was what I did while I was in grad school. I was volunteering, teaching night classes in Hartford, Connecticut to like Somali refugees, Iraqi, later Syrian refugees, folks that were trying to learn English, get their citizenship. And part of, I feel like my job, like informally, was helping to demystify that for the surrounding community, or folks that were like destigmatize things that we've been taught to believe about people from other countries or other certain religions. So, but yeah, one little anecdote I like to share about my Afghan soldiers is like, I was telling you, we work 6 days a week. You work really intense schedules, but it's like that most people are on a 90-30 or 60-60 day rotation where you work for 2 or 3 months and then you get like a month off. And I had finished my first 3 months, like September to December or whatever, and I was going home just for like Christmas break. And on the day before I flew out of Kabul to go back to the United States for that little break, my students all showed up to class with like gifts, like goodbye gifts. And I was like, I'm not leaving, guys. Like, I'm going to be gone for like a few weeks. And they're like, no, this is what we do. You're getting on a plane. It's a big trip. It could be dangerous. Like, we'll hope you have a safe. And it was just, and they were giving me little gifts to bring to like my mom and they knew I had a twin sister. They're just like the sweetest guys, giving me little scarves and like, little tchotchkes, like mugs that had the Afghan flag on them. And I just, out of nowhere, I didn't even know that they had just kind of like planned this to give me these little gifts as a surprise. And I almost was like in tears because I felt so guilty. I was like, I don't have anything to give them. I went home to the US and I picked up some gifts to bring back, but like, it was really the sweetest, most gracious thing. And it made me feel like, I mean, most days we were just under such intense teaching schedules, and I didn't really have too much time I never knew if they really liked me or not. I just was, at first it took a little while to build those friendships. It's like building a rapport, and building trust takes time. And when I first got there, it was like, there were so many strangers to get to know, and that just made me feel like I'm welcome. Like they want me to come back. And, and it's hard too, because their English was so basic that they couldn't always communicate what they wanted to say, even if they wanted to let me know that they valued that time that we had together in the classroom. So anyways, it was just a sweet little anecdote, but the year was filled with the year that I was there. Like, I had so many moments like that where the guys just blew me away with their hospitality, which is something that like their culture is known for. And like you said, I hope people here realize that. And if you spend any time with an Afghan, like if you go volunteer with a refugee resettlement organization that's been hosting Afghan families or supporting them, like you'll find that even the little that they might have to be getting on their feet right now, like they will share that. Like they will open their doors and like make you food and like give you with what little they have, because that's just who they are. Like, taking care of each other is who they are, which is why when we left, we said we're going to take care of you. So,
and that is, I want to get back to the interpreters, but before that, I wanted to ask something just broadly about when you were there, because one of the things we heard about why the withdrawal had to happen so quickly, or that the Afghan, the whole lie that the Afghan army collapsed so quickly because they just couldn't keep up with things.
Yeah.
One of the things about the Afghan Air Force in particular is it required this Contractor Core to keep going, and we pulled that Contractor Core out. And I wondered, was the intention of what you were doing to kind of get their reliance on that Contractor Core, or to kind of like make it them less reliant on that? Did they recognize that that was a problem back in 2017?
Oh yeah, that was the whole point of like when things transitioned from the training mission. I think it was like in 2013, or by 2015, like things had gone from like a direct action combat mission for NATO, and it turned into like we're training. It's like train the trainers, and we were all supposed to be working ourselves out of a job in theory. If I teach you guys enough English, then you can teach each other. Or we were training, actually, a lot of the Afghan interpreters we were getting them ESOL licenses online so that they could be teachers when we left, because their English was good enough. And so the same thing for like the maintenance instructors, or the American pilots, U.S. veterans or active duty that were there training. It's like in the end, we're doing this because we want to enable the Afghans to do this without us. However, there were things like the logistics pipelines, like getting equipment, aircraft and all the equipment, it's like that's coming from other countries, right? And how do you order that? You order that through software that's specialized and proprietary for security reasons. So that all has to go through the U.S. government. Those pipelines were never handed over to the Afghans. I mean, again, like a lot of the stuff we were doing, for example, in the classroom was like paper and pencil. We did not have computers. Even if we did, we wouldn't be using them. OPSEC, like there's no way. The networks, securing networks like that. So like a lot of the logistics support, the materials that were going to support those flight lines was coming through these defense contractors, or DoD contracts, and that was something that everybody knew was not going to be handed over to the Afghans anytime soon. That was just like there's parts of this that they could take over at some point, and we hope that they do. Like they were amazing pilots. These guys were like the bravest guys like they stood up this Air Force and like. Well, they built their Air Force in like 10, 15 years. That's amazing. The people that want to come from provinces and be like, I want to fly and fight for my country. Like, those guys were brave, talented, amazing air crew. So they, something like that, like they can train themselves to do things like that. They had mechanics, Afghan mechanics training Afghan mechanics under the supervision of NATO contractors. But there were certain elements of that flight line that were not going to be handed over to them, and so that was part of my frustration too, watching those press conferences during the evacuation when that narrative was going out from the White House and the Pentagon that, well, we gave them everything they needed, they just didn't want to utilize it. And it's like that whole for anybody that was working in Afghanistan, they would see right through that. And so that was very difficult to listen to, because it was basically saying they weren't brave enough, or they didn't have like the gumption or the commitment. And it's like, that's none of the people I work with fit that description. So that's why I started writing. It's like, I'm going to tell their story because it's worth humanizing these people and talking about their bravery, because it was there. For sure, there were certain elements of the ANA out in various provinces that did capitulate to the Taliban, where the Taliban was basically in power from day one. And I always try to touch on that. It's very different criticizing people from the outside or from 2,000 miles away in a living room in the United States. We've never dealt with an insurgency like that where terrorists are living among us, and you're making calculations in your head as a soldier about, in a culture where like a family is so dependent on the head of household, the man. If he dies, who's going to take care of his family? Are they going to be sold off to the Taliban, married off to the Taliban, tortured and killed by the Taliban?
Yep.
I mean, come on.
And that's exactly what we saw happen. Right? Like, these women-run households, like, what are they doing right now? There are very few women allowed to work. And back, before the Taliban took over, maybe they could have, right? But, like, now it's just, what do you do? So
they're selling off everything they own and just hoping that they can make it by.
Selling their babies, it's
horrific. So I think that's why, like, for a soldier that's like, I don't want to, if I fight, like, there is no fight. I'm going to just basically be slaughtered. There were videos going around in the summer of 2021 before the Taliban made it to Kabul of them capturing, rounding up Afghan special operations forces and just like massacring them on viral videos. And so, that's what these soldiers knew they were up against. And I think they were making a lot of calculations that people that have never had to deal with that don't have to make. So
Yeah, it's so easy, like you said, to be a couch, like
an armchair quarterback in a combat
crazy.
zone.
Yeah,
no.
it's like, y'all, no, you weren't there. And that's why, not to once again go back to the people who are involved in this effort to continue supporting Afghans, like I feel like they all do that because they know the reality of what occurred. And it's amazing how many people there are like that. And it's a pretty big community considering, and 20 years will create a large, and I'm amazed when I get more and more messages from people who are like, I did this way back when, and I want to come talk about it. And it's like, hell yeah, let's all talk about it. And maybe we'll make enough noise that, or at least we correct the record, with historically accurate fact.
Yes.
Let's talk about the interpreters. So when you left in 2018, did you keep in contact with the interpreters that you had worked beside, and were you involved in their like SIV applications and things like that?
Well, so we worked with about I'd say 12 to 15 guys pretty closely, and most of them by 2021 had gotten here, had their SIVs processed and made it here. And again, their English being as good as it was, they were able to navigate that 14-step process by themselves, and they were pretty self-sufficient. I did have one guy, who the interpreter that I was closest to, who I write about. His name is Mo in most of my writing. That's his pseudonym. But so Mo was the guy that I worked most closely with, and he was applying to his SIV. He started his application in 2018 when I left Afghanistan. So then in 2019, he did ask me to help write him a letter of recommendation, which I gladly did. Kind of was following his application, but it was taking forever. And then, he was basically the only one I was keeping in touch with until everything started falling apart and everyone was reaching out for help. Yeah. But, so in 2021, as the contractors are getting pulled out in the spring and then Bagram goes lights out, I think it was June of 2021, Mo and I are texting. I'm like, buddy, what's going on here? And he said, well, I did get my final interview. It's in September. And I was like, phew, thank God. He's going to get out in September. He'll be good. And then July rolls around and he's like, I don't know what to do. There's rumors that the State Department might have special flights for us. As all of us would later find out, the descent cable was going up the chain in the State Department, and, encouraging the State Department to think about evacuating some of these allies. And, so he was very much I don't know, do I roll the dice and wait until September? Or do I run away to Pakistan right now with my family? And I always try to remind people, if any of these folks had fled, because people would be like, why didn't they leave earlier? They knew this was going to happen. If they had left, as you know, their visa would have been canceled because it was being processed through the Kabul embassy. So they wouldn't have just been able to show up in another country, go to an American embassy and have somebody pick up their application and process it, which I think may be happening now. But I mean, this was in the summer of 2021. He was like, I need to stay here with my family and hope that the Taliban doesn't come rolling into town before September, which ended up happening. So that was very devastating. But so I was keeping in close contact with him about his application. And then I say about out of the 15 guys that we worked with most closely, those interpreters, 12 of them made it. Mo eventually got on a State Department flight last year. He had to wait, but he was stuck in Kabul for a year, hiding out from the Taliban. And then so we still have 2 or 3 guys, 2 that I know very closely that are still stuck there and are just in line waiting.
Wow. And how are they keeping safe right now? Just do they need to stay in their homes, or are they pretty okay to
I think in the beginning it was going to extended family members' houses and hiding out where they knew that they could. I think now most of them, it's they've kind of grown out their facial hair. They have their traditional garb on, just trying to fit in, and they say it's a little freer to move about, but it's still terrifying every time you end up at a Taliban checkpoint and you don't know who's gonna pull up what information about you or ask you what questions. So they're still very scared, but they're not like they were in the beginning when they didn't know what was going to happen. So but it's just to me it's not so much the fear now that I'm hearing from them, but just the hopelessness and the feeling of, I wish I weren't alive. This is living in hell on earth, and just this desperate helplessness that they feel, and then again the helplessness that we feel. I don't even know what to type back to that. What am I supposed to say? I can't hit the fast forward button for you, and I can't do anything else for you. So but that's why I tried to maintain the advocacy as long as I could, because I was like, this is the only, I'm trying to show, part of the reason I got involved in any of this was to show these guys, like, look, like, I'm trying, here's me, social media posts, like, calling Congress, like, I'm really, this is all I can do from here, so, yeah, but anyways, so, we did keep in touch with them.
What about, so the digital Dunkirk aspect, when did that start?
Yeah, so, as soon as things fell on August 15th, like, we all started getting, like, the flood of text messages and WhatsApps from our guys, from both the soldiers that were stuck there and the interpreters that we knew. And so I was in, like, a Facebook group immediately with, like, the other English teachers, like, are you guys getting text messages? Like, I'm not sleeping. Like, I don't know. What can we do for these guys? Meanwhile, some of the U.S. veterans that I had worked with on the Special Mission Wing in Kabul had put together, like, a Facebook chat trying to help get the soldiers out. This is, like, August 15th, 16th. We still had high hopes we could get all these people out. And so one of the guys, this American crew chief, he was a U.S. Marine, went back to contract in Kabul training the door gunners, the Afghan crew chiefs. And he reached out to me and he said, hey, like, we're getting all these Afghans sending us text messages saying, I worked on the SMW, and we don't know who's bluffing or who's telling the truth, because, like, if you've, like, seen an Afghan name on paper, they usually have, like, the first name, last name, family name, grandfather name. There's these long names. And as an English teacher, I had those rosters that I mentioned, like, class rosters. And they're like, hey, do you have any of your, like, class rosters left over, or do you remember, like, the guys you taught? Can you help us look over the names that we're getting and see if you recognize any names? Because we are trying, this American was telling me, he's like, we are trying to figure out who's who, and if these guys really worked with us, because if they are, we want to get them on the list and try to put together some rosters to try to get these guys out. Because the Special Mission Wing was special operations, and the Taliban had specifically said, we're coming for the SMW, we're coming for special operations soldiers. If you worked with the Americans and you were trained by them, like, you're going to be on the top of the hit list. So it was pretty desperate to try to get those guys out. So I that's how I got kind of, like, brought into digital Dunkirk, was at first just looking over their names, but then I became, part of that direct effort to reach out to the Afghans via Facebook or WhatsApp and be like, hey, can you send me your passport, your wife's passport, your kids' photos? And we started doing those unofficial databases in Microsoft Excel. And then it kind of grew from there. So I was like, those guys were all either active duty, some of them were still active duty U.S. and U.S. veterans. And they're trying to call up their buddies who know so-and-so, who knows so-and-so, who's down on HKIA right now, part of that evacuation effort. And I was like, I don't have those connections. However, like, I write. I've done a lot of writing before. So, like, why don't I try to go, like, write some op-eds or, like, write some social media posts? So I went to LinkedIn and just started connecting with every person, like, anybody that had gone to West Point, because I had already had some connections that were U.S. Army aviation. And so I started, like, just networking on LinkedIn. And then I think General Petraeus, like, reposted one of my things, and so then I got more connections, and I was just trying to, like, reach out to anybody. Like, do you guys know who's running the latest, what was it, like, Allied Airlift had, like, that database that you could enter Afghans into that you were trying to get out, and delineate who you knew that was SIV, who was SMW, who was whatever. So we're trying to look for, like, any people that look like they have an avenue out of Afghanistan for people. And so that's kind of how I got into it. And then when one of my articles got published, because I had built that support on LinkedIn, I had people, like, resharing it and things like that, and kind of, started getting some exposure and traction that way.
That's amazing.
But I stayed in, like, even after the the 26th, the bombing, like, when things stopped and everything came to a halt, the advocacy kind of turned from, all right, well, we can't get these guys out, but, like, we can still try to argue for accountability and for justice. So I stayed in the scene, September and October into November, when things kind of shifted from writing articles about the Afghan interpreters to writing about the veterans and moral injury and what this whole thing had done to them. So, I guess I was in it for, like, that 2 or 3 months, and the beginning, it was the same as everyone. Like, no, I'm not eating, I'm not sleeping. Like, when it's 10, 11 o'clock at night for me, that's when my Afghans are waking up, texting, like, do you have an update? What gates are open? How can I get into the airport? And so we didn't sleep, we didn't eat, we were, any free time you had was, like, entering things into the databases. And I was lucky at the time. I was unemployed, so I wasn't lucky, but I was like, you know what, maybe this is a silver lining to being unemployed. Like, I can do this full time. And so it was. I think that was one of your questions you asked, was it 24/7? And I was like, it Yes, 24/7 up
Yeah.
to the very second.
What about the successes? I mean, were there successes along that path that kept you going, or what did keep you going through that insane effort?
I mean, I think it was just like the hope that I'm going to get one win. Like maybe I get one person on a plane and everyone just wanted like that one, you know, like you're just spending days like crying and texting your other Americans. Like I just had to tell this guy like he's not getting on a plane. Like I don't even want to, I don't know what to do with myself right now. So it did feel very hopeless at times. But I think when I got the first op-ed I got published, that felt really great because that was like telling this. It was basically it was with Military Times. It was called Breaking Hearts and Minds, talking the ode to like winning hearts and minds, which is what we asked a lot of our service members to do and build those human bonds. And I felt like we were breaking them. But in that article, I told the story of Mo, my interpreter. And so when it got published, it was like something I could turn around and say to him, like, "Hey, buddy, like I know you're outside HKIA right now, and you're terrified, and there's nothing I can do to get you on the other side of that T-wall. But like, I wrote this about you. Like, I want people to know your story. Like, you protected me, and you fought for us over there, and we're fighting for you over here." So that felt really good. I mean, it was stuff like that kept me going, and then that led to like, Mother Jones. I knew a guy who worked the immigration desk for Mother Jones, was a family friend, and he did a profile on the SMW soldiers and the interpreters. And then CNN saw that Mother Jones profile, and they called me up one day in the middle of evac, and they're like, "Hey, do you want to come on and talk about the interpreters with Aaron Burnett?" It was like a production assistant for Aaron Burnett, and I was like, "Oh my God, like I can't be on national TV. Like I'm not eating, I'm not sleeping." Even if like totally fine, like I'm a nervous talker, I would never like I'm happy that I get to talk to you today, but as you can tell, like I could be a bit of a rambler, and I was like, there's no way I'll humiliate myself on national TV right now. However, would you consider interviewing one of our Afghan interpreters? Like all I'm trying to do in writing these stories is give them a voice. Like literally, I would love to hear one of their voices on your show. And they were awesome because at first they were like, "I don't know if the producers are going to let us do that," and he'd have to be like on camera, and I was like, these guys can't be on camera. Like they need to be anonymous. So it was a little back and forth for like 24 hours, but they agreed to interview one of our interpreters via WhatsApp, just the audio, not his face, and use a pseudonym. So one of the guys that I mentioned that's still stuck over there, he was the one. He was on CNN for like 15 minutes. And Aaron Burnett got to ask him, like, "How do you feel? Like, what do you think the United States should be doing for you right now?" And he got to talk, and the American people got to hear him. So for me, like, that was another huge win, even though it was like 3 days later, everything stopped, and he was stuck there. But it was like, I'm glad that the world got to hear his voice, and I got to help him do that and tell his story. And again, like those few articles and that little exposure later on when I was writing other articles, those are things I could be like, "Hey, like I already did this." Like, and it was kind of like a little bit of a, I don't want to say, like, I'm not trying to like boost my resume, but it gave me a little credibility so that I could continue to try to speak for other people, and people knew who I was. And so I felt like those were things I wanted to do, and I would, if I could go back and do it all over again and have it turn out differently, I would. I wish those guys got out. I wish none of that ever happened. But, you know, at the same time, like you asked, like it was being able to continue to write op-eds through the fall and keep exposure on it felt really good. There were hearings in Congress on Afghanistan in September and October in the House and in the Senate. And I wrote about my reaction to those, again, from the standpoint of like, here's these people talking in Washington, D.C., all their little PR talking points ready to go for the camera. And like we're still getting these text messages from these guys. They're still terrified, and we still owe them. So what kept me going was, obviously I said like that, the exposure kept me going, the wins in print, but also the people in the community of the digital Dunkirk, folks like yourself that I came to know online through Twitter and LinkedIn. I mean, 99% of the people in digital Dunkirk that I knew the closest, I have never met in real life, and I may never, but they became some of the fastest friends of my life in those 3 months, and we continued to support each other. So that also kept me going, and I think a lot of folks in the scene can say the same.
Oh yeah, I can say so clear. I mean, imagine what would have happened with the withdrawal if there were no social media. I can't even, it would have been the worst thing in the world. And like you said, I sign on to Twitter, and sometimes you have a hard day. Sometimes, I mean, I've been sick the last 2 days, and I had no energy whatsoever, and I was like, I'm not touching Twitter. But then I get on, and I'm like, I'm feeling better, and look at all these people who are still doing the thing, and like, we're all still doing the thing, and we're all maybe slightly, I don't know, out there and weird, whatever, but it's an incredible community of people who are still trying to do the best that they can for Afghans. And I can tell there is a shift. Like you said earlier, and I didn't say anything at the time, but the desperation and I hear from this one lovely young lady who has just had a really hard time, and she's in her early 20s, and she's just this beautiful young girl who had everything in front of her, and then it all got taken away from her. And she'll tell me, death is better than this life, which is, I've heard that statement over and over again from Afghan women. And what do you say? And like, yes, we're all here and we're all feeling like we're doing something, but it never feels enough when you really look back and you're like, damn, like what do we do for these people who, it's a very, very difficult, environment to be a part of, but at the same time, it's good to be in company with people who understand how devastating it is and who are still trying to make a difference, when it's especially hard now to talk about Afghanistan in the media because we have so many competing huge dumpster fires going on in the world. So
yes,
it's
there's no shortage of human suffering.
No, there's not.
In this day.
No, there's definitely not. I can't imagine the digital Dunkirk atmosphere. I was trying to figure out what can I write right now, and I didn't have those networks, and so it's so neat to hear about the people who were involved in those networks and what they did. And I wanted to ask you too about Fort McCoy. In 2022, what was Fort McCoy like? I mean, were these people who had come over during the initial August? Yes. Okay, and they were still at Fort McCoy in 2022 when you were there. So tell us about that then.
Yeah, so this is part of Operation Allies Welcome, which was like $800 billion that the U.S. government was like, all right, like we're going to bring all these Afghans here, but we need to house them before we can give them like permanent housing in the U.S. So there was like 6 or 7 sanctioned military bases. I think the 2 biggest ones were Fort Liberty in New Jersey and then Fort McCoy out in Wisconsin. And so Fort McCoy had been like, I think the original like point where people were brought into. So they had originally taken like 12,000 Afghan refugees, and a lot of those, like people might remember those images of like hundreds of Afghans being packed in the back of like C-17s. Like that's a lot of those Afghans ended up there, like folks that were lucky enough to just get on those planes when people were like rushing the runway at HKIA. And then I think the folks that came in like the later in the 2 weeks of the evacuation, more of those folks ended up in like Fort Liberty. So folks that may have had like a green card or some kind of visa, or like extended family members of Afghans with green cards, like so they ended up at different military bases. I say that because so at the time that I went up to Fort McCoy in January of 2022, this was like 4 months after. So like in August, I'm at home like writing these op-eds ferociously, continue to do that through September and October. November, I'm like, I can't keep doing this. Like I need to find work. I need to be making money again. And that's when a friend of mine was like, hey, they need some teachers up at Fort McCoy, like English teachers. And they're looking for English teachers that have worked with Afghans. And so like the 2 of us were like, we'll go. It's like, we worked in Afghanistan together. Like, why not go support, the element up there? These Afghans have been living on this military base in the middle of winter. They got evacuated in Kabul summer with clothes on their back. They're in the up in the Wisconsin winter. And the resettlement agencies in community-based organizations across the U.S. like haven't had the time to like organize and get ready for them. So like they're just waiting in these barracks in the cold, and like, yes, like let's go give them some like life skills, English skills for when they're finally out in their communities. So it seemed like a good opportunity. The only like hesitation we had, like there's like a trepidation, because it was like we're still trying to get our Afghan interpreters out and soldiers that we knew. And we're going to work with all these folks that like were lucky enough to get on planes, who like a lot of our interpreters they were, I don't know if salty is the right word, but it was like, what's it going to look like? We're helping all these Afghans that got here that didn't necessarily have a connection to the U.S. NATO mission in Afghanistan. And like, you're taking selfies with the little kids you're teaching up at Fort McCoy. And like, I don't want to post any of that stuff because my interpreters are like, hey, we're still stuck over here. Those people, that was our spot. We should have been on that plane. Like that attitude was there, even if people weren't saying it out loud. Like, I was getting very heated WhatsApp messages, like, who are you working with? How did these people get to Fort McCoy from the Afghans that we worked with? So it was kind of like at first like a conflict of interest. But I mean, again, like my background in refugee education, I'm like, I'm happy that anybody got here and got away from the Taliban. And at the end of the day, I think all the Afghans that we worked with were all in agreement of that, despite the heartbreak they felt at being left behind. So I got up there, and it was like January 2022. That original 12,000 that had come to Fort McCoy was down to like 6,000 or 7,000, and then there was like rapid de-escalation from there. So from January to the end of February, those 6,000 people were then resettled out into American communities. So we only worked with them for about 2 months, and then it was the teaching grant that I was working at Fort McCoy was like a 4-month grant. So we spent 2 months teaching Afghans, and when they were flown off the base to go live in their permanent communities, we spent the next 2 months working with ESOL teachers in Wisconsin, or community organizations that were working with Afghans for the first time ever, trying to set up cross-cultural workshops and things like that. How do you like teach English if you've never done it before? People that were volunteering to welcome Afghans into their community. I know you mentioned earlier, like now it's like, people can still be skeptical, and I think that the war on terror, especially how we entered things after 9/11, like there was a lot of Islamophobia, and like people are scared of immigrants from certain places or certain religions. But we saw this like overwhelming, like I think there were polls at the time, like public opinion polls, that people like, do we want to resettle these Afghans? And it was like 80% of Americans were in agreement, like, yes, bring them in, like we owe them, we don't want to be seeing these scenes of devastation on TV. Then of course the news cycle moves on, so I don't know where we are now, but we saw in Wisconsin, even these rural communities in Wisconsin, like taking in Afghans and being like, how can we support them? How can we give them a house? How can we give them a van? Like, how can we bring them dinner? I want to teach them English. And so people were really trying to open their doors and open their hearts. We saw that a lot. Again, it's hard to keep that momentum up as things fade from the news cycle. Like you said, people are still readjusting. They're going to be rebuilding their lives forever. So it's not time to like give up on that. People can still reach out to local faith-based or community-based organizations that are working with refugees and asylum seekers and help them support those folks as they rebuild their lives here. But to get back to your point, like Fort McCoy, it was basically just like there was a little element of, I was part of a team of 4 English teachers, and then there were like 8 FEMA reservists. So folks that normally go into like tornado or natural disaster zones and help people, they were assigned to come teach English. So like we were teaching English with FEMA reservists to these Afghan refugees, and sometimes teaching the adults, sometimes teaching like, dozens of kids in the classroom at the same time. And it was just like, I was so happy to know that they were safe here, and also kind of scared for what life was going to be like for them. We heard that folks went on from Fort McCoy and like Fort Liberty, like I said, in New Jersey, when they got out to their permanent housing in whatever community they ended up in the U.S., it's like now they have to find housing and find jobs, and the kids have to go into school, and what's that going to be like for them? And some of them were living in hotels for months, or living like having to like ask for more money on their little food stamp card because they got like $100 for like 12 days or something, and they got like 4 kids. And so we had stories in the beginning of people having a really rough time, and some of them still are, as you mentioned. But yeah, so Fort McCoy was just kind of whirlwind. It was only 2 months that I was up there, but it still felt good to be helping people that did get here.
It's incredible.
Do capacity building with Americans that wanted to help.
Mm-hmm. It's an awesome thing. I mean, it kind of fits perfectly with what you had been doing. You've done every aspect of this, it feels like, with the skills that you have, and I think that that's really telling of the kind of person that you are. It's a huge thing. What kinds of complications and issues were Afghans facing when they were at Fort McCoy? I mean, were people dealing with illness, or was it mostly just, we have to figure out?
Well, so this was still during COVID, so yes, that was a big problem, because it was one of the big challenges was that they were living in open bay barracks, which posed a number of challenges that I'll try to cover and not go off on tangents. But so living in the open bay barracks, COVID was getting passed around. Now all the Afghans were given COVID vaccines. I think when they got to Qatar from Kabul, they were brought to Qatar, processed in Qatar, then sent to different military bases in the U.S. for those few months. And so they were all vaccinated, but there were a lot of folks coming onto the base to work with the Afghans, whether it was medical professionals or faith-based organizations, or we were on like a public teaching grant And so people were bringing COVID in and out, which was tough because if the Afghans, like, let's say, for example, a family got notified, like, there was, like, a little processing office on base that was working with, like, San Diego, Los Angeles, Boston, and, like, trying to get these Afghans out to go live in those places. It's like, oh, we have a flight for your family, but if any of you test positive, then you have to wait another week. The Afghans really wanted to get out of base because, like, they had been there, again, like, it's cold, so they're like, they can't leave the barracks because it's like negative 15 degrees. There's even, it's a military base with nothing for them to do on it. Like, there was like a little recreation. I think they had one of the MWRs like reserved for part of the day for the Afghan kids to come play games or do whatnot. But basically, they're just cooped up in the winter. There were reported incidents of like domestic abuse that were happening, not just like husbands and wives, but just like fighting between families or like neglect. There were parents that were just catatonic. Dealt with the most trauma they've ever dealt with in their life, like leaving Kabul. Like they had to leave family. Some of them didn't get to say goodbye to their family. Some of them watched people get killed on the way into HKIA. I mean, you can't even imagine like the horrors these people witnessed. And then they end up in like a foreign place where they don't understand the language and they've got nothing. And they want to go home, but they have no home now. So to tip of the iceberg, but yeah, so like people were just like unable to move, unable to eat. There was depression. So like, and then we had these kids coming to class, and like we had one kid show up one day. It was like -10, and he doesn't have socks on. His hair's not brushed, and it's like, who's taking care of him? Like his older sister, who's like 8, because the mom couldn't the mom was like unable to do what she needed to do, and my heart broke for like the whole family. But there was a lot of instances like that where it was just like, that's why part of the effort was to like get people off base as fast as possible, like get them to communities where hopefully people can fill these gaps here, and like they can have their privacy in their home, and they can get into their own routines and not be so dependent on on what was available on the base, which is pretty bare bones. I mean, they there was like cleaning crews that were contracted to come in, and food crews and things like that. They were supported, but it's like, coming from what they came from in Kabul, watching your country fall apart, your family fall apart, understandably, it was very, very difficult for them to be housed on the base.
Yeah, I hate to tease things that are coming in the future, but there's a group that's doing some mental health support for Afghans, and it's like, when I heard that, I was like, that's exactly what these individuals need after living in a war zone where life is very, to quote Jason Houck, short and brutal, and now it's really short and brutal under the Taliban, but the things that they saw, the things that they've dealt with, the ongoing just trauma, and it's like Maslow's hierarchy. You can't grow until you have like security, and it's not security when you're living in open bay barracks. Like, imagine if we had to do that, it would not feel like you have safety. And
or just even the safety to like open up and like cry. I think they did have like a little women's support group on the base where like the women could get together and do like a little sewing circle, and so we can just kind of like, but it was like where they would just come to like be vulnerable with each other, because it's like, you got to let that stuff out. And when people would reach out, like after the base had like closed down the operation, and we were doing like some of those capacity building or train the trainer things, and people were, American social workers were asking like, what can we do? How do we support all these things? And it's like, mental health, that was like number one across the board. It's like, they need mental health. These kids are getting into schools, and I have people from school districts contacting me like, we've never had Afghans, like what do we do? And I'm like, this like this is trauma-informed instruction, which you need to be trained in, what these kids are carrying around invisibly, but like they need to be seeing the school social worker. They need the parents in their country. Behavioral health system, it's not like it is here. Like here, you have to be an advocate. You have to be able to navigate systems, and we have those things that maybe in other countries they don't necessarily have for mental health or behavioral health support, but people don't even know it's there because they never had it at home. And even if they had it, it was even more taboo than it is here to access those things. And so that whole cross-cultural element of providing mental health support for people that have never accessed it or don't know how it can help them was huge to try to get people to understand. And then it's like the limited capacity of like Afghan American therapists that already are here, like there is some of that, but like those folks were overwhelmed. Like if you're like Dari or Pashto speaking therapist, it was like everybody in the country wanted your contact info. So it was tough because there wasn't enough to go around at the time. And I mean, we had like names of regular like physicians, like just like family physicians or pediatricians that were like out there, like if an Afghan needs to talk to me and they're living in Fairfax, like give them my number. But it was kind of just like here and there, but on a broader scale, like I don't know, like I assume people are still dealing with untreated you know, things, untreated traumas and untreated conditions that came from that time.
Oh yeah. Well, and even for Afghans who are already settled, like we had one of my favorite individuals was on this podcast actually with the story of how he was an interpreter. He had survived several horrible incidents, including an IED blast that left him like comatose for months. It took him 6 months to learn to walk again, 4 months to be able to see again. And when he came here, you know, he was adjusting, he was going to school, and as soon as the country imploded, he then had to take responsibility for his parents who were left behind and his uncle's family. So he's now working, you know, I don't think he took a day off for 6 months, working multiple different security and delivery driver jobs, you know, trying to keep up his own family, stopping school all together, and he's never complained. He's the kindest individual. I've never heard him complain, but I know that like the mental load that he had to take on. And then he flew back into Kabul. Flew back into Taliban-controlled Kabul to get his parents out so that the Department of State would be forced to get his parents out, but then had to leave his young siblings behind because they wouldn't bring his siblings because they were not eligible. And like, just imagine like that whole and he'll talk about is how hard it was for his dad, because his dad had been high ranking in the intelligence directorate. And, you know, he was having a real struggle wondering when the Taliban were going to find him and execute him.
Yeah.
But like, you know, he'll never talk about the wait for himself. And I know that it's there. So, and I think that kind of brings us right into the final thing I wanted to talk about with you, which is moral injury. And I think that there's moral injury to go around among volunteers, among military personnel, among everything. And I wanted to hear first from you, you know, how do you define moral injury for yourself? I think everybody kind of has a unique take on what it is and how it presents, but I think that they're all accurate, and I wanted to hear your descriptor.
I mean, I saw that question beforehand, and I was like, oh, I could cite the VA definition, which is, I've cited in my writing, which is when you participate in something or witness something that goes against your moral beliefs, your ethos, like who you are. And so for me, it's like it's pointing to the emotional wound that's caused by knowing who you are and who your convictions are, and either having to do something that goes against that, or watch it happen to other people, and that transgression that occurs when you're part of an organization. So for a lot of like U.S. service members, it was watching the military or your government do something that you can't. You feel helpless. You have like no power in the situation, and that can cause that moral injury, because it's like, well, wait a minute, like my moral is that when I raised my hand and swore an oath to my country, not me, but you know, like a veteran or service member would say, like I said I would never leave anybody behind. You know, I said like this is what I stand for. Like the ethos of my unit or this battalion is that like this is what we do. Like we train partner forces, or we work with indigenous forces. Like this is what we do. Like we work shoulder to shoulder with people, and we don't leave them behind. And then basically they felt like they were being told, like during the evacuation, like actually we're gonna have to leave these guys behind, and like please don't talk about it or like make a big stink, and like in your unit or your team, like just deal with it how you gotta deal with it. And it's like, that's not good enough. Go talk to your battle buddy if you're having a rough day. It's not good enough. Like I had people around me, the U.S. veterans that I was working with in Digital Dunkirk, like I mean people that were absolutely at like the bottom of a very dark pit, and I was scared for them. People that have given up time with their families, their kids. They're so desperate to get their Afghan on a plane. They don't know how to do this thing you're asking them to do, because you trained them for 20 years to do the complete opposite. And so that was what caused a lot of moral injuries with people I was working with. It's like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to leave somebody behind. I don't know how to pick up the phone and say to my guy, I can't get you out. It's over. Which is not. We're still fighting for people. But I mean, that broke people. That literally broke them and left this injury, this invisible injury, that's very visible and very physiological for them and for the family around them. And it's just like, that's thousands of people going through this. I think we mentioned this either at the beginning when we started recording or right before that, how this is a 20-year war where, like, I mean, it's hundreds of thousands of U.S. service members involved in this war in some way, shape, or form. And for the folks that have deployed to Afghanistan and, like, work with Afghans, it's like they built really deep human relationships, and you can't flip that off like a light switch. And just because, like, the administration has their talking points, or any administration would have their talking points at a time like that, like, that doesn't fly with the people that know what's going on or are getting those messages 24/7 from people that think they're going to die. And they can't help them. And it's like being on a battlefield where you're, like, on two sides of a wall and you can't get to the other side to help the person. It's like there's an ocean between us and a lot of red tape and, like immigration red tape that, like, we can't get around. And so, yeah, I think that was just, like, a deep wound for a lot of people to deal with. So, like I said, like, in November of 2021, I started writing about that. I started interviewing the guys that I was working with because I was like, you guys need to talk about this. If you're not going to go, like, I mean, I would hope that some of them were able to access therapy and talk about what they need to talk about. But I just was like, you need to share your story because everyone's going through this and you guys all feel alone, but you're not alone. Like, everyone, like, if people hear your voice and they feel like it's okay to speak out about this. So, I mean, I ended up having to interview quite a few of them anonymously. People did not want their names in print. For a lot of them, they would even say, like, I don't even know if this is moral injury. I just feel a deep shame. I'm ashamed. And they didn't want to, they were happy to talk to me about what they were feeling. And I think they felt, like, safe with me because I'm a civilian. I'm a woman. And I worked in Afghanistan. So I get what they're going through. But, like, I'm not one of the guys in their unit that might judge them for it. So they were very open with me, but they were still very hesitant and scared to, like, put their names to paper. But anyways, long story short, like, most of the articles that I wrote about moral injury were based on a series of quotes from these interviews with these guys. And just like when I interviewed Afghans for those initial op-eds, I wanted the moral injury articles to be by veterans and by U.S. service members. It's like, these are your words, and I want other people to see your words in print. So they can say, like, that person's feeling what I'm feeling. I am not alone. And it's okay to be feeling what I'm feeling. And we're all going through this deep shame together. And hopefully we can come out the other side together. And that's another distinction I like to make when you ask to define moral injury, is that a fella I interviewed, his wife is actually a licensed clinical social worker who treats veterans of moral injury. And the point that she likes to make when she's treating folks was like, PTSD is something different. And that's very hard to treat. Some people are always going to be living with that. Moral injury is something that can be treated and can be worked on, especially if you find things that are empowering and remind you of who you are, doing things that are in line with your moral values. So continuing to fight for Afghans, continuing to advocate for the passage of the Afghan Adjustment Act, continuing to volunteer to work with Afghan families resettling in your communities. These are all things that can help restore somebody's moral integrity and their honor in combat, like, serve as the antidote to that shame and that moral injury. And just being in community with people, like you said, that are going through this and still processing these things. So yeah. I like to say that because it's like, it's not a hopeless thing. Like, you can come back from moral injury. We can't undo anything that happened in 2021. We can't take back what was lost. We can only go forward from here with each other. And yeah.
I love that you say that. And I think it's important too to say, like, there is no diagnosis of moral injury. Yeah. Like, you can't go and get diagnosed. And I think about, when you're talking about this, I was thinking about Operation Allies Refuge Foundation, which specifically was created to help the veterans of the withdrawal, who had to see so many things that they were not prepared to see, who had to, turn people away, who they said, okay, we think that you probably are good to go. And then the State Department said, no, you're not. And they had to go take them out into the crowds and watch the Taliban execute people that they, maybe not somebody that they turned away, but they don't know. They don't know who the Taliban is executing outside, as the Taliban is providing security for the U.S. at freaking HKIA. Oh my God, watching that was morally injurious. And that's the thing, is it's such a widespread phenomenon, and I do think that that's why so many people have tried to make a difference. And I know for OAR Foundation, they say, like, we're all working together to do better things, like Joe Law is like, I'm gonna, we're volunteering, we're helping Afghan refugees, we're doing, it's definitely, it's a huge load. And I'm hoping, especially for people who are there, it's hard to get a PTSD diagnosis when you don't have, like, combat on your DD-214, and yet you were in a combat zone. There are just so many nebulous things right now about what happened at HKIA. Was it a combat zone? You know, what those things should not impact whether or not a veteran can go and get assistance and be able to just talk about it and figure out, what can I do? How can I process this deep shame? God, my Brene Brown, like, I want to give everybody a Brene Brown set, you know, like, let's kill the shame. But
well, and the more people talk about it, like, the less of like a thing where it's like, what even is that, or is it real? It's like, well, yeah, we're all talking about it and everyone's dealing with it. Like, it's real, and y'all need to pay attention. I mean, my first article in Moral Injury was like very pointed, like, military leadership. You need to be listening. I don't know if anybody from military leadership read it or what, but that one was in Stars and Stripes, and it was the first few publications that I was like shopping it around to, or people that asked me to write that article in the beginning. It became too much of a hot button issue because I was going to writing it for military leadership to read. Like, you guys need to take responsibility for this. These decisions were made at the top, and those people are not turning around to U.S. service members and taking accountability for what they just asked them to do. You know, conversations in Washington, D.C. that, you know, are audience facing, like, you need to turn around and face U.S. service members and deal with this crisis that you've created. So that was kind of a tough, and who am I? I'm some chick who was like not even in the military. So it was like, who are you to write about this? But that's why I was trying to like use those U.S. veterans like as like, it's these guys are saying this. It's not me being like, hey, moral injury is a thing, pay attention. It's like, these guys are saying like, I don't know how to feel about this. And some of these guys are still active duty. They're in these units that like are tasked with training partner forces and working with them. And they're like, how am I supposed to turn around and go do this in our next mission set when like this just happened? You know, they want to have faith in leadership. They want to have faith in the chain. And anyways, so I could go on.
Oh no,
but yeah, I think you've
it's a really important topic, and I'm hoping that people are listening and that people do, you know, it's the most important thing in terms of like, yes, we need to finish the mission with helping Afghans that we left behind, but we also need to take care of our own people who were deeply hurt by what happened. Yeah. And that's just taking accountability too, which still isn't happening and is very frustrating. It's an acknowledgement. Right. Yeah. Acknowledge that it happened, and I'm glad that everyone who's out there talking about this, I hope they keep beating the drum, because it's not about, and I know that for you, it's not about like, let's just like beat the Biden administration. We hate the Biden. Like, that's not it. Yeah. It's not about that. It's not about that for me either. It's just like, we've got to make sure this never happens again, and make sure that we clean up what was not done right and acknowledge that it wasn't done correctly, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to, because we always close our episodes when we have them with stories from the people of Afghanistan about what they've gone through. And so today's story, actually, I almost teased it. Right. I almost teased it because we were talking about Afghans who were part of the military operations right up to the end. And so this is from a man I'm calling Obaidullah, and it's kind of a unique thing. He didn't write this as a letter. He actually wrote it to me in a Twitter direct message, and there are parts to it. But basically, it's about his father who served in the Afghan National Army, and kind of there are some updates in it that show just how devastating the situation continues to be for Afghans who are facing all these issues in the aftermath of the withdrawal. And I'm reading it in his own words. So let me put things up right, since I can trust you. My father worked as a commando officer as part of the Special Forces Corps. He led battalions of commandos in various missions across the country, from Faryab province in the north to Badakhshan and Kunduz in northeast, Jalalabad in the east to Spin Boldak in the south. Without any biasness, I have to argue that he has done his job with honor, bravery, and integrity, which I, as his son, was an eyewitness to. The day Kabul fell to the Taliban on August 15th, my father was on duty at a military base in southern Kabul at Poli Charki. The family was in contact with him until late in the day. He and hundreds of commandos were waiting for orders from officials higher in command. All of a sudden, I learned from Tolo News that President Ghani had fled the country. It was around 4 or 5 p.m. local time. The family contacted my father, who reported that he and the other commandos were ordered to stay in the base until further notice. In that extremely shocking and chaotic day, almost for everyone in Kabul, he continued to forward messages from high-ranking military officials through WhatsApp that threatened the commandos in the base not to move and to stay in place until my father came home late that night around 12 or 1. He and the other commandos were disarmed by Taliban fighters in the base after they were instructed by higher ranks to put down their arms and submit them to the Taliban. That night was literally a nightmare for me and my family while we waited for my father to come safely home. Not only because of him, but because a total system had collapsed like a house of cards before our watching eyes. No one slept at home except the children. Everyone was shocked. My father was given a so-called letter of impunity. The letter was disgusting. It was written on a piece of paper, barely readable, with no stamp. It was not a letter by any standard. It was short and very crudely written by a Taliban fighter, God knows who had no education, that he was disarmed and signed. I asked my father, how can you keep that piece of paper? It could get torn or disappear very easily. Now, after 2 years, I am not sure if my father still has that paper with him. My father is in Afghanistan. He changed his location many times. He failed to extricate himself from the country. Until recently, he hoped that things would change for the better. Unfortunately, our relatives in the provinces that my father lives in now report to him that he had better leave and change his residence or else he will be in trouble, because the Taliban recently started to arrest former military personnel, torturing them and asking them for weapons and money. Today, my mother shared the issue with me. I was deeply saddened because I was helpless to aid my father at this critical time. I couldn't do anything but jump on Twitter and write you a message. You have my consent to share the story and bring this to the attentions of listeners about the hardship and extremely traumatic conditions for former Army men and their families. So the update on this happened just a couple months ago, and he said, "Hello, my father, as I told you about him earlier, just arrived in Pakistan. He needs help to be resettled somewhere safe. I very much appreciate it if you can do anything in your capacity to help him." And then last Monday, because right now Pakistan is in the process of deporting Afghan refugees who are not there legally, he said, "My father is in Islamabad now without documents, in constant fear of being deported into the hands of Pakistan police. He resisted for 2 years and hoped that the Taliban would change for the better. When he learned that the Taliban were looking for him, he was forced to flee to Pakistan, and I hope this issue would be raised in the podcast." So I'm so grateful that Obaidullah shared that, and it's just a reminder, you know, these people.
Thank you for using this
there.
platform to share those stories and share those letters. I mean,
that's important. Like, we can talk about this, right? And like, yes, it hurts us, but there are people who are still living in just, really, really difficult positions. So for others like Obaidullah, if you want to share your stories, we encourage you, please, to send them, because it really, I think it is so much more moving than anything else we could do. The show address is the Afghanistan Project Podcast at gmail.com, but obviously Twitter works fine, or LinkedIn, or anywhere that you can find me. I will listen as best I can. Joan, I want to thank you for coming on and just telling your story and sharing your passion, your passionate advocacy for Afghans. It's the kind of work that people like yourself have done that kind of has helped me keep my faith in this country, even in really difficult times. So thank you.
Likewise. Yeah, no. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. For all our listeners, thanks for sharing your time and supporting the people of Afghanistan. Contractor Core, and we hope to see you again soon.